You are not here by accident, and what you are about to hear is not just another message meant to capture your attention. It is a serious invitation to look deeper because what is at stake is not a simple idea about faith or a surface level religious teaching, but the way you stand before the greatest mystery on earth. The Holy Mass is not an ordinary ritual, not a cultural habit passed down through generations, and not a symbolic act with no depth. It is the moment where heaven touches earth, where the eternal enters time, and where your soul is called to wake up and become fully aware. If you are hearing this right now, it is not coincidence. God does not work randomly, and he never wastes a moment. He knows exactly when a heart is ready to see something that can completely change the way it lives. And today, this is not just about giving you information. It is about opening your eyes so you stop living the Mass as someone who is only physically present while inwardly distracted, distant, or asleep. Slow down your thoughts. There is no need to rush. The soul does not understand speed, it understands stillness. Only when the inner noise begins to quiet down, when the mind stops chasing endless thoughts, does space open where something eternal can enter. Because what you are about to understand cannot survive in a restless heart. It only enters a heart that is available. And now a question arises that very few people ever truly ask themselves. What actually happens in that moment of the Mass when the priest lifts up the Eucharist? Not what you memorized in catechism, not theological definitions, not rehearsed explanations, but what happens in the invisible, in the eternal, in the divine reality that is unfolding beyond human sight. While many bow their heads out of habit, while others are thinking about their problems, their work, or what they will do later, while some are simply present without truly being present, something immense is taking place. Something that belongs to another order of reality. Something so sacred that if the human soul could see it, as the saints have seen it, it would never remain indifferent again. In that moment, Christ offers himself to the Father, not as a memory of the past, not as a symbolic representation, but as a living and mysterious reality made present again. The same sacrifice of Calvary becomes spiritually present in a way that is real, profound, and alive. You are not watching something distant, you are being drawn into it. It is as if heaven opens for a brief moment, as if all creation holds its breath before the weight of divine love being poured out. The Father looks upon the Son offers himself, and you are there with the extraordinary grace of being able to unite yourself to that offering. Imagine for a moment that you were physically standing at Calvary, that you could see Jesus on the cross, hear his breathing, witness his suffering, and observe his complete surrender. You would not be distracted, you would not check the time, you would not think about anything else. You would be still, silent, fully aware that something beyond comprehension is taking place before your eyes. Yet this same mystery in its deepest spiritual reality happens every time the Eucharist is elevated during the Mass. This is not poetry, it is not exaggeration, it is spiritual reality. The tragedy is that many do not know this, many do not believe it deeply, and as a result, they pass through this moment without receiving what it carries. Here we encounter someone who understood this truth deeply, Padre Pio. He did not see bread and wine. He saw the living Christ truly present, truly offering himself. That is why he said with a force that shakes the soul that the world could live without the Son, but not without the Holy Mass. For him, the Mass was the heartbeat of heaven on earth, the invisible lifeline that sustains the world spiritually. When the Eucharist was elevated, he would enter into a profound spiritual reality that most people never perceive, because his soul was awake to what was truly happening beyond the visible. And you, in this very moment, are given the same opportunity to stand before that same Christ, even if you do not fully perceive him with your senses. But here comes a truth that is difficult because it is real. The first major failure of many believers is not open disbelief, but distraction. A quiet distraction born from routine, from familiarity with what is sacred, from no longer trembling in the presence of mystery. Christ is lifted, Christ is offered, Christ is present, yet the human heart is elsewhere. This is why so many graces never reach their fullness. Not because God is unwilling to give, but because the soul is not present to receive. The elevation is not a decorative moment within the Mass. It is a window into heaven, a brief but eternal opening where your entire life can be placed on the altar. Your wounds, your burdens, your children, your fears, your decisions, everything you are can be placed there. And Christ unites it to his own sacrifice and presents it to the Father with a value beyond human understanding. But for this to happen, the heart must be awake. And this is where everything begins to change. Because once you truly understand what is taking place in that moment, you can never look at the Mass in the same way again. When this truth begins to sink into the soul, something inside you starts to shift. You can no longer treat that moment as something ordinary or passing, because once you understand that heaven is opening, that Christ is truly offering himself, and that you are being invited into that offering, silence is no longer empty. It becomes language, presence becomes participation, and attention becomes an act of love. This is where many people quietly fail without even realizing it. They remain silent on the outside during the elevation, but inside the mind keeps moving without control. Thoughts continue to appear one after another, worries about the future, memories from the past, unfinished responsibilities, scattered prayers that have no clear direction. And while God knows every heart completely, there is something he waits for in that moment. Not a long speech, not a memorized prayer, not an emotional reaction, but an interior attitude of surrender. Because the elevation is not a time for asking small things or repeating formulas. It is a moment of union, a moment to stand spiritually beside Christ and simply offer yourself with him. The saints understood this with clarity. Sainte Therese of Lisieux, for example, did not fill that moment with many words or requests. She simply offered herself, small and open, united to the great sacrifice of Christ. And that simple interior movement carried a depth that words could never express. Because when you unite yourself to Jesus at that moment, your entire life enters into the heart of the Father in a new way. Nothing is wasted, nothing is ignored. Everything offered in that union gains a spiritual weight that cannot be measured by human standards. There is something very important you must understand deeply. During the elevation, you are not only looking at Christ. Christ is also looking at you. He sees you completely, without distortion, without distance, without misunderstanding. He sees your struggles, your failures, your hidden efforts, your silent intentions, and even the things you cannot put into words. And despite knowing everything about you, he still offers himself. That is the kind of love being poured out in that moment. A love that does not withdraw from human weakness but enters into it. This is why the silence of the elevation is not an empty silence. It is a charged silence, a silence filled with eternity. It is the kind of silence where the soul can speak without words, where intention becomes prayer, and where a single sincere offering is more powerful than countless scattered phrases. Many believers struggle here because they do not understand the rhythm of prayer within the Mass. There are moments to ask, moments to listen, moments to give thanks, and moments to offer. The elevation belongs to this last one. If you use it only to think about problems or repeat personal requests, you miss the depth of what is happening. Not because God rejects your needs, but because this moment is larger than individual concerns. When you unite yourself to Christ's sacrifice, your needs are not ignored. They are taken into something far greater, transformed within the offering itself. The mistake is believing you must speak a lot for prayer to be real, but God is not looking for quantity of words. He is looking for truth of heart. He is looking for your presence, fully given without division. This is why some spiritual teachers have said that in that moment, the most powerful prayer is not a long petition, but a simple act of trust, a quiet inner yes, a surrender that does not explain everything but offers everything. When this happens, the Mass stops being something you simply attend and becomes something you actively enter. You are no longer a spectator, you are part of the offering itself. Your life, joined to Christ, is placed before the Father in a way that is real and living. And here is where a subtle but powerful transformation begins. Because once you start living that moment with awareness, you begin to realize that silence is not something to escape. It is something to enter, and in that silence, God is not absent. He is acting in ways you cannot immediately see. But there is something even deeper that still needs to be understood, because offering yourself is only the beginning. There is another dimension of the Mass that many overlook completely, and without it, something essential remains incomplete. Once you begin to understand what it means to offer yourself during the elevation, another layer of the mystery slowly opens. The Mass does not end with offering alone. Something even more intimate follows, something many people approach every week but rarely fully understand: receiving. Because receiving the Eucharist is not a passive action. It is not a routine step that follows the offering. It is a profound spiritual reality, just as serious and just as sacred. After Christ has been offered to the Father and your life has been placed on the altar with him, the moment comes where heaven moves even closer. God desires to enter you, not symbolically, not emotionally, but truly. The same Christ who offered himself now desires to dwell within your soul. And here is where many lives lose something precious without even realizing it. There are those who receive communion quickly, almost automatically. Others do it out of habit, without interior awareness. Some are physically present in the line, moving forward step by step, but inwardly they are elsewhere. And when the heart is not prepared for what is happening, grace still enters, but it finds very little space to expand. The saints approach communion differently. They trembled not out of fear, but out of awareness. They knew they were receiving the King of the universe, the living God, the fullness of love itself. Saint Teresa of Avila taught that after receiving communion, the soul should gather itself inwardly, as if guarding a priceless treasure, because Christ is truly present within. And here is a truth that must be stated clearly. The most important moment of the Mass does not end when you receive the Eucharist. In many ways, it begins there, because what follows requires silence, attention, and interior stillness. Yet many people, right after communion, immediately fill the space with words. Rapid prayers, memorized formulas, scattered thoughts of gratitude mixed with requests. And while God hears everything, this is not always the deepest way to live that moment. Because when Christ enters you, the first response is not speech, it is presence. Imagine someone you deeply love finally arriving after a long absence. Would you immediately fill the moment with words, or would you sit quietly beside them, simply aware that they are there? The Eucharist is that reality, but infinitely greater. Jesus is within you, not as an idea, but as a living presence. And he is not waiting for noise, he is waiting for space. Space where he can act, heal, strengthen, and reorder the soul from within. This is why silence after communion is so important. Not because silence is a rule, but because silence is the natural language of deep love. In that silence, Christ works in ways that are not immediately visible. He heals wounds that were not even spoken. He brings clarity where there was confusion. He strengthens what was weak, often without any emotional sign. Padre Pio once emphasized that after receiving communion, the soul should remain in recollection for some time, because that moment is not repeatable. It is a gift that passes quickly if ignored. And when it is lost to distraction, something precious is missed, even if the Eucharist was received properly. There is also a subtle struggle here that many do not recognize. The distraction does not always come from obvious sin. It comes from haste, from inner noise, from the mind rushing back to problems, responsibilities, and external demands. And while life continues, something sacred is meant to remain active within. To receive well is to extend what began at the altar into your very being. It is to say internally, what I placed on the altar I now receive transformed. It is to allow Christ not only to be offered for you, but to live within you. And when this begins to happen consistently, something slowly changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deeply. The way you respond to life shifts. The weight of anxiety begins to loosen. The grip of certain sins weakens. Your interior life starts to find order. But here is something important that must be understood clearly. You will not always feel it, and that is completely normal. Grace is not dependent on emotion. Sometimes communion feels full of peace, sometimes it feels dry, sometimes it feels like nothing at all. Yet if the soul is open, Christ is still working. Mature faith does not rely on feelings, it relies on trust. It remains faithful even when there is no emotional confirmation. And this is where real transformation begins to take root. After communion, do not rush back into noise. Do not immediately return to mental distractions. Stay, remain. Let the silence continue. Because in that silence, even if you do not notice it, God is doing something that will reveal its fruit over time. And yet, even this is not the end of the mystery. Because what happens inside the Mass is not meant to stay inside the Mass. It is meant to continue into your daily life, where everything you have received is tested, lived, and slowly transformed into a way of being. When what you receive in the Eucharist begins to settle into your life, something very important becomes clear. The Mass does not end when you leave the church building. In reality, it begins to extend into everything you do, into your decisions, your reactions, your words, and even the way you carry your daily struggles. This is where many people unknowingly disconnect. They attend Mass, they receive communion, they participate in the rituals, but their daily life remains unchanged. The same reactions, the same frustrations, the same patterns continue without interruption. Not because the Eucharist lacks power, but because it has not been allowed to shape life beyond the moment. The Mass is not a shelter to escape reality. It is a formation that is meant to transform it. What is placed on the altar is meant to continue in your actions outside of it. What is received in communion is meant to influence how you speak, how you forgive, how you endure, and how you respond to everyday challenges. And here is a truth that can feel uncomfortable, but is deeply freeing. If the Eucharist does not gradually change the way you live outside the church, then something is being blocked within, not due to a lack of grace, but due to a lack of integration. A divided heart where one part participates in the sacred moment while the rest continues unchanged. But Christ does not enter you to remain contained within a single hour of the week. He enters to remain with you, to walk with you, and to see the world through your life. When this is understood, even ordinary moments begin to carry a different weight. You start realizing that every day holds small opportunities for offering, moments where you can unite your frustration, your fatigue, your uncertainty, or your sacrifice to what you lived in the Mass. A difficulty at home, a burden at work, an injustice you face, or a quiet personal struggle can all become part of the same offering if your heart is trained to see it that way. This is how the saints lived. They did not separate the altar from daily life. For them, the Eucharist was not a moment in time, it was the center from which everything flowed. St. John Paul II reminded the Church that the Mass does not end with dismissal, but with mission. You leave not as someone who has finished something, but as someone who carries Christ into the world. But this requires a deep inner shift, a move away from living in fragments. One version of you inside the church, another version outside. One identity during prayer, another during daily pressure. The Eucharist calls you toward unity, where belief and life slowly become one reality. This does not mean perfection. It means awareness. You begin to notice when something in your life does not align with what you receive. Not with guilt, but with honesty. A quiet recognition that invites change rather than condemnation. And yes, this can feel demanding, because real faith does involve change. It asks you to adjust habits, to reconsider reactions, to forgive when it is difficult, to step away from what is easy but not right. Yet this is not a burden placed on you, it is a path into deeper freedom. When the Eucharist enters daily life, the soul becomes unified, no longer split between belief and action, no longer divided between prayer and behavior. And in that unity, something surprising happens. Life does not necessarily become easier, but it becomes clearer and more grounded. You are no longer carrying everything alone. This is why many people feel the Mass does nothing for them, not because it lacks power, but because its influence is not carried beyond the church walls. It remains contained instead of becoming lived reality. But when even small moments of your day are connected back to the Eucharist, everything begins to shift. A difficult situation becomes an offering. A moment of frustration becomes a prayer. A burden becomes something shared with Christ rather than carried alone. Little by little, life becomes integrated. Not perfect, but whole. And in that wholeness, even ordinary things begin to carry eternal meaning. And yet, even after all of this, there is still one final reality to understand. Because living the Eucharist is not only about personal transformation, it is also about what sustains you when everything around you pulls in the opposite direction.